My all-time Michigan defense next on Michigan Podcast Extra.
But there's going to be one team that's going to play solely as a team. No man is more important than the team. No coach is more important than the team. The team, the team, the team.
Looks deep for Anthony Clark. Waits for it. Hit. Caught.
This is no time for that. In the pocket and a sack. Tim Jamison.
Brady gets terrific. Throws it, and a touchdown, Knight again. Schultz just before Brazil got him, and a leaping interception by Woodson.
Harbaugh back to throw over the middle. Caught by Collier at the 5 on his feet. Touchdown, Michigan. On its way. It's good.
He's 5'7", 179 pounds, a junior at Michigan. But Jamie Morris packs a wallop, and he delivers for Bo Schembechler.
And here's your first play. Pressure coming, sack. It is Glenn Steele, number 81, who fought his way through the traffic.
Option. And Robinson calls his own number, and he's going to score. Oh, an easy touchdown for Robinson and Michigan.
Win it. We're going to win the championship again because we're going to play as a team. And when we play as a team and the old season is over, you and I know it's going to be Michigan again. Michigan.
Go Blue, and welcome to this latest Michigan Podcast Extra, where we give you a little extra to tide you over during the offseason as we get set to launch Season 2. And we're going to be launching Season 2 coming up at the end of July with our 2018 college football preview. You don't want to miss it. I know a lot of you had a chance to watch last week when we unveiled my 35th anniversary as a Michigan fan, all-time Michigan offense, the best players on the offensive side of the ball from 1983 to 2017. Well, now we take a look at the defense, and joining us to critique or compliment me when he thinks the case may be on my selections, Michael Spath from WTKA in Ann Arbor. Good to talk to you again, Michael. How are you?
I'm great, Steven. I'm really looking forward to this. And the only thing is I'm going to be a little bit curious because when you do like a defensive line, I'm going to maybe need to know all four guys because I'm going to jump in and be like, oh, how do you not have Mark Messner? And you'll be like, I do have Mark Messner. Oh, okay. Well, then there you go.
Now that you've had some time to think about it before we get to the defense, how'd you think I did on the offensive side of the ball?
I thought you did a really good job. I remember when we were talking, a little bit about it last week, and a handful of guys, but I mean, it's anytime you put together a list like this, if you're deciding between, hey, Jim Harbaugh or Drew Henson or Tom Brady, who is the best I've ever seen, that's a pretty good problem to have, picking against three of the greatest quarterbacks in Michigan history. And so, no, anytime you pick one of this, it's all about almost personal favorite, right? Your personal favorite, maybe because of some bias. You watched the game with your dad, you were there in person. I have my own personal bias a little bit, but I'm trying to take a little bit of that outside of this and look at this objectively as I tear apart your list here, Steve.
Well, let's get to it. Defense wins championships, and this would be my championship defense, the best players from the last 35 years to wear the winged helmet. Let's begin on the defensive line, and you will be pleased right away with our very first selection, Michael. It is your pal, Mark Messner, one of only two Michigan players, I think, to be all Big Ten. Actually, he did it 4 years in a row. I think Anthony Carter did it 3 years in a row. But Mark Messner is the first member of our defensive line on my all 35th anniversary Michigan team.
Well, you are starting to be correct there because there actually are two players. Steve Hutchinson did it also, four-time All Big Ten first-team performer. Mark Messner every week joins us on Inside the Huddle. on Mondays, Mark Messner Mondays. Great guy. You know what? I've only seen clips because I was pretty young when he played. But the clips I've seen, it's truly one of those cliche terms of a man amongst boys. He seems to always get to the football. When you put up 26 tackles for loss in any given season, it is one of the more incredible accomplishments you can have because teams start to defend you. There's just no way that you can, get through any game, especially in the later half of the season, without them knowing who you are and putting, 2 hats on you every single time. And to still get there shows just what type of a player that you are. You have a relentless drive, and more than that, you have incredible talent and just smarts to be able to figure out how to get to the quarterback every couple of plays.
Well, a couple of things just to put in perspective what Mark Messner did here. He played in an era Michigan played more of a read and react defense, not the kind of stuff we've seen in modern times with Don Brown or even when Jim Herman in the late 90s kind of introduced the zone blitz to Michigan. 2, we played in an era in the Big Ten when really outside of Mike White at Illinois, Hayden Fry at Iowa, you did not see a lot of pro-style passing attacks. You did not see a lot of quarterbacks doing 5-step drops. I mean, Michigan State in that era with George Perlis were still primarily a rollout passing team. So the sack opportunities just weren't available to you as they might be in another era. So when you take a look at those 2 things that he did on top of what you mentioned, that after you do that as a freshman year, you're a marked man. We saw this kind of early in the year last year where there was so much focus on Rashawn Gary. You saw Chase Winovich and Devin Bush get off to great starts after all that offseason hype. I think that puts into further focus just how dominant of a player Mark Messner was.
No, 100%. In fact, he's a very humble guy, and I've asked him repeatedly, like, what would you do if you were in today's game? And he'll never say, but I've talked to some of his teammates, and his teammates will say if he played in today's game and he had the opportunities like Maurice Hurst did with Don Brown's defense and to play next to Rashawn Gary and Chase Winovich, they've said, I think he would have had 35 tackles for loss and 18 sacks. And I'm like, come on, that's hyperbolic. And he's like, trust me when I tell you, this guy got after it every single snap. So, no, it's hard to compare eras, but he is certainly maybe the most deserving player on your entire defense, with the exception of maybe number 2 in the defensive backfield.
Well, you mentioned Maurice Hurst. That's a good segue to where we're going next. My money, the most dominant, pure defensive tackle I've seen as a Michigan fan. He should have been. I went back and looked. Michigan has not had a pure defensive tackle taken in the first round of the NFL draft since the Bears took Dave Seymour in the 1970s. All right, so he should have been a first-round pick. I'm not surprised. I doubt you are to hear reports about how he was tearing it up in minicamp for the Oakland Raiders as a 4th-round pick. But he's the next selection. Pro Football Focus rated him the number 1 defensive player in America in 2017. He's next on my all-35th anniversary team.
The thing that I think really distinguishes Maurice Hurst from a lot of defensive tackles is guys have power, guys have strength, guys have a couple of moves, but, he's a former running back. He played running back in high school out in Massachusetts, and he has the quickest first step for a man 290 pounds or so that I have ever seen in my career covering Michigan football. And I think that's what made him so good, is that as soon as that ball was snapped, it's almost like that offensive center would pick his head up, and Maurice Hurst was already over his right shoulder. And when you're in that type of position, you're kind of at that point, you know that you're not going to go full block on him. All you're kind of hoping to do is to chip him enough to get him, to push him past your quarterback. But I love Maurice Hurst, and I think the longer we go along here, and hopefully he has a nice long NFL career, because he's had a little bit of the heart issue, and that's what got him downgraded in the NFL draft. But I really hope that he has a great NFL career. He's going to be one of those players, I feel like Brandon Graham, that years after the fact we're talking about and almost appreciating his career more after he's left than even when we did when he was here.
Our next defensive lineman, Chris Hutchinson, a guy who, if you count his redshirt year, won 5 Big Ten championships at Michigan, an All-American his senior year, multiple All-Big Ten seasons. Your thoughts on his addition to this club?
Chris Hutchinson, yeah, another guy that played, right around the time that I was 11 and 12 years old. I've heard stories from my dad. This is one of his favorite players. Just said he was one of the nastier guys that he's ever seen in the defensive line. We had him on our show a couple weeks back, and extremely humble guy, but a very smart guy, and a very much a guy aware of maybe his own personal legacy without doing so in a way that is like conceited or self-absorbed, but just kind of saying like, hey, I know how good I wanted to be, how badly I worked to be that good, and I feel like I achieved what I wanted to achieve. And that's an awesome attitude to have, because he was going to do everything he possibly could year after year to be the best football player he could be. And he certainly went out and did that for 4 years. And, terrific. When you talk about the early 90s and, you eventually get to like the Glenn Steeles and then James Hall and Rob Rainus, they all have to trace back to Chris Hutchinson, who set the role, set the path for them early on in the 1990s.
And we wrap up our defensive line with, you want to talk about the era in which he played. Brandon Graham played on one of the worst, maybe the worst offensive team in modern Michigan football history. Then in 2009, you had the freshman quarterback, another team that didn't go to a bowl game. He was not surrounded by a lot of great talent. He was everybody's focal point every single week. Hell, half the time, Mike, he didn't know who his defensive coordinator was going to be, okay? And yet, he was unblockable, absolutely dominant, and a force of nature, and we've seen him continue that well into his National Football League career as well.
All right, I'm going to throw something out here to you, Steve, and you might think it's crazy talk, but if you love Brandon Graham as much as I do, maybe you won't. You give me Charles Woodson and you give me Brandon Graham, and there's the two best defensive players in my lifetime, in 38 years of Michigan football. And I know Mark Messner played during my time. I know Lamar Woodley played during my time, and you can go through Jared Irons and Sam Sword and all these greats. But Brandon Graham, to me, is the most underappreciated and yet the most accomplished and incredible defensive player that Michigan has had. You're right. He played on a team that the offense flat out sucked. I mean, it made last year's offense look like, the Dallas Cowboys. Absolutely awful. And the defensive line he played with was not bad, but he had, a couple different coordinators. Rich Rodriguez didn't know how to use him, and yet he went out there, and every week he would just destroy teams. We can't forget some of the highlights against Michigan State, Ohio State, Wisconsin in his senior season. But, yeah, you give me Brandon Graham, and you give me 11 Brandon Grahams, I win multiple national titles every single year. I mean, I guess I should say I win a national title every single year, and you can't win multiple in 1 year. But love this guy. Absolutely so glad that you picked him instead of Woodley or David Bowens or someone like that. 100% deserves it. And we saw the season he just had with the Philadelphia Eagles and helping them lead to a Super Bowl title. This guy is as good as it gets defensively.
When we talk about he played with teams that were bad on offense, here's why that's key for fans that wonder what's that have to do with anything. When you are a pass rusher, a lot of the biggest plays you're going to make in a game are obvious passing situations, meaning when a game is close at the end, like we saw Brandon Graham do in the Super Bowl just a few months ago, or you're way ahead and a team has to throw because they're behind and you can just kind of pin your ears back. He didn't face a lot of either one of those situations his last 2 years at Michigan, which means he kind of had to take the dirt road to accumulate a lot of those stats. He wasn't facing a lot of situations where Michigan was way ahead and the other team's throwing 35, 40 times a game in order to catch up. I mean, this was the hardest path possible for a guy to accumulate the sort of statistical dominance Brandon Graham had.
And when you add that into the factor, I mean, it's kind of like Mark Messner in a different era. When you throw all those things equal and you go back and say maybe like comparatively to Lamar Woodley, who had, 12 sacks and set a single season sack record in 2006, but you say, well, he had, maybe Lamar Woodley had, 30 or 40 more opportunities than Brandon Graham. You're right. That's an incredible statistic. And I think he's the only defensive player in Michigan football history that had 3 seasons of 8.5 sacks or more. And I think only one of 2 guys that had double-digit 10-sack seasons. Or I should say twice had double-digit sack seasons. So really, his numbers stand up against the best of all time.
Let's move to the linebackers. And I went with a 4-3 alignment here. I think 2 of those linebackers, for me, were absolute instantaneous no-brainers. The third spot I really had to think about because I think there's several candidates for it. And I'm going to start there. I gave this slot to Larry Foote. He makes my all-35th anniversary team. Your thoughts?
I can't argue with that one. I mean, linebacker's a hard position because as good as Michigan has been over the last, your lifetime, you're in these 35 years you're talking about, linebacker, they've had, I would say, probably 10 guys that are all kind of fit in the same same type of level without any one of those 10 guys maybe really distinguishing himself from the group. But Larry Foote was, one of the most athletic linebackers, former safety out of Detroit Pershing, really brought the speed to his position. I mean, the one thing I really appreciated about Larry Foote was that there's no running back that I didn't feel could ever get the angle or could ever get the edge on Larry Foote. If you went wide, and a lot of teams, Wisconsin and Iowa that I remember, wanted to use kind of like that, pulling a guard and getting outside and doing the sweep, sweep tosses. You could not out-sweep Larry Foote. And when you have a linebacker that can move as well as he can, and you essentially eliminate teams from being able to outflank you, that's a huge asset to have on your defense, and that's what Larry Foote brought to you. All
right, next linebacker, and this might be where I cheated a little bit because I had to have him on my team. Was he a defensive end? Was he a linebacker? I decided yes.
Oh, boy.
So I have Lamar Woodley next at linebacker on my 35th anniversary team.
Yeah, I think this is completely cheating. Completely cheating.
Hey, I'm willing to own up to it, though. I'm owning up to it.
You know what? Here's your argument to say is like, I couldn't pick between the two, and you know who else couldn't pick between the two? Jim Herman when he was at Michigan,
yes,
as defensive coordinator.
Yep.
Because he went back and forth with Lamar Woodley. If you're going to cheat and you're going to throw him on there, then I can't really, I'm not going to say anything bad about him. And he was a great player. Had 12 sacks in 2006. You know what? And here's where I'll give you a little bit of flexibility here. He went on then and played in the NFL, and he played as a 3-4 outside linebacker, something that I didn't know he was going to be able to do. He was going to be able to stand up in Pittsburgh's scheme and be able to handle, the tight ends and handle some of the drops into coverage that you're required to do with the Pittsburgh Steelers, and he was able to do that. So if you want to bend the rules a little bit, you've got a player that was versatile enough to do that in Lamar Woodley.
Final linebacker, Michigan's only Butkus Award winner, Eric Anderson.
Wow. So there's a lot of guys, Sam Sword and Dahani Jones and,
Jared Irons was the guy who had a hard time leaving off the team, was Jared Irons.
No, I got one other one for you. I tell you what, you passed on, I'm going to give you a hard time about one guy. You passed on David Harris. And David Harris, to me, in 2006, is the guy that made that defense. I mean, Sean Crable and Prescott and Lamar and Terrence Taylor and Alan Branch, and you can go on down the list. But David Harris in the middle of that defense, whatever you played, whatever type of offense you brought, he was there to clean it up. So Eric Anderson, Butkus Award winner. I always say this, could Eric Anderson play in any era? I don't know that Eric Anderson would have succeeded in this era today. I think David Harris would succeed in any era. So that's what I'm going to disagree with you on.
Yeah, when you are the only guy to do something at a school as decorated as Michigan and to win such a prestigious award, that's a major tiebreaker for me. Let's go to cornerback. This one, of course, is an absolute no-brainer.
I'm not even talking about Woodson. Woodson, Charles. Okay, done. Conversation over with. Move.
Yeah, I can't watch it, and I still show every chance I get on YouTube. I show my son the most incredible interception I have ever seen. The in the air, backhanded, over your head pick that he had against Todd Schultz in Michigan State in 1997. That play is etched in the memory bank as one of the all-time greats I've ever seen from a guy in a winged helmet, Michael.
I'd agree with you. I mean, every time I see it, I still get chills. I remember watching the game. I'll tell you a personal story. I was accepted at the University of Michigan on the day that Michigan played Michigan State, and I'm running around the house, super excited about my acceptance letter. And then I watched that game, and I watched Charles Woodson do. I mean, he defied gravity. I mean, he defied every conventional wisdom you had for what a cornerback was supposed to be. And everybody, the Champ Baileys of the world, the Marlon Jacksons, the Darryl Greens. I guess Darryl Green was maybe for him, but there's a lot of guys that came after him that have all tried to measure up to what Charles Woodson was at Michigan. And what he was a guy that when we talk about taking away one side of the field, I mean, he truly did. You did not throw to his side of the field because it was worthless. He either picked it off or he broke it up or it ended up on the ground in some fashion. Best defensive player in school history, probably the best player in school history, one of the 5 or 10 best defensive players in the history of college football. I'll never forget. I remember almost every single time that he made a big play in 1997. They won a national championship because of him. his legacy continues to endure here 20 years later. That's the no-brainer that if you were to pull 100 people and say who was on your anniversary team, every single one of us agreed that Charles Woodson's on it.
Next corner to make my team, and some would argue he'd be better if I put him at safety because he played both positions. You already mentioned his name, Marlon Jackson.
Well, I would disagree that he'd be okay at safety. He struggled this one year that he played at safety in 2003. That was not a natural fit for him. But in terms of cornerback, one of the things I really liked about Marlon Jackson, and if you go back to the 2002 season as a sophomore, but really his 2004 season as a senior, one of the most physical corners you'll see. I mean, he's a guy that, kind of like a prototypical NFL corner now, 6'1", 195 pounds, and really he won the battle with wide receivers at the line of scrimmage. And, we look at like the rules that are in place for wide receivers, but if you can get your hands on a guy within that first 3 yards and you can disrupt his time with his quarterback, well, guess what? That guy is shut down before the play even gets started, and you don't need to be the fastest guy downfield. You don't need to be the guy that has the best hip action, and those are things that Marlon was good at, but he disrupted so many routes just at the line of scrimmage. That's what made him such a competent and incredible cornerback, and he's a great pick. He's a great guy. He's gone on to do incredible things in the Indianapolis area with foundation that benefits young kids, benefits middle schoolers. He's exactly what we think of and what epitomizes the idea of a Michigan man, was when he was in school and is now. And probably, I'll say this because I've got to know Marlon a little bit. I think he is a better person than he was ever a player, and he was a damn fine player.
Now we move to safety, which has not been a great position of strength over the last 35 years for Michigan, but this player absolutely is a no-brainer and belongs on the list. I think absolutely the best safety that's played for Michigan in my time period. I think people forget after he blew out his leg against Minnesota his senior year just how great the tandem of he and Veda Murray were in the late 80s. I'm talking about Trip Wellborn.
Can I tell you a funny story about Trip Wellborn? And if you listen to the show, Steve, and you've probably heard him. Have you heard him on the Game of My Life when we had him on before?
This is about what Bo did to his jersey?
It is, yeah. Bo, he walks in there in spring practice, and he played wide receiver his first year, and Bo asks him, hey, we could really use you on the defense. What do you think? And Trip weighs on it for 24 hours, and he goes into Bo's office and says, Bo, I've been thinking a lot about it, and I know that, you guys could use me defensively, but I envision scoring touchdowns and catching the big passes, so I'd like to stay a wide receiver. And Bo says, okay. And the next day he shows up at practice, and he can't find his jersey, and he asks the equipment manager, and the equipment manager says, oh, it's over there. And he's like, it's over with the defensive guys. And he says, yeah, you're playing defense now. And so he tells Bo, he says, Bo, I told you I wanted to play offense. And he's like, I asked for your opinion. I didn't tell you I was going to take your opinion. And so Trip ended up a defensive player and two-time All-American safety. And, when we were in the backyard playing football when I was growing up, we would pretend to be Greg McMurtry and Trip Wellborn, and I'd play against my older brother. I was always wide receiver. And wouldn't you know, him playing safety would always win. And I would say, no, this isn't fair. You're older than me, you're bigger than me, and stronger than me. And he goes, but you know what? Trip Wellborn always wins, so there. So I always thought that was great that my brother kind of brought that into the equation a little bit. But no, I mean, he was awesome. He was awesome. Michigan has been, with the exception of Trip Wellborn and Marcus Ray and maybe a little bit Tommy Hendricks and Dwayne Patman, I mean, those are the four guys that I could think of that Michigan has been waiting for a decade for one of those guys to walk through the doors again.
Well, neither one of those names are my final safety. I went with the last Michigan safety to be close to a consensus All-American. Ernest Shazor was the final member of my all-35th anniversary Michigan defense.
Steve, we were so close to me agreeing with 10 out of your 11 picks. And then you had to bring Ernest Shazor out into the open here. So I'm the anti-George Costanza. I like to close on a low note. Yeah, there you go. You know what? It's fine. A lot of people love Ernest Shazor. He's essentially he'd be a great Viper right now. He'd be playing Khalif Hudson's position, be playing close to the line of scrimmage. In terms of his ability to play close to the line of scrimmage as a strong safety, there are a few that are better. I take umbrage just because I've heard a lot of stories from former players that used to drive them nuts because he never knew what coverages they were in, and he'd play the wrong coverage, and then they would have a deep pass over the top of them, and they would come back to the sideline, and they'd be like, Ernest, what happened? And he'd be like, you guys are in the wrong coverage. And three out of the four defensive backs would agree which they were supposed to be in. And Ernest Shazor was the only one that didn't know what they were doing. So I take a little bit of umbrage with that in terms of his coverage ability, but close to the line of scrimmage, devastating tackler. He is the guy that he should have played linebacker. Frankly, he should have bulked up a little bit and just been a linebacker. He should have been, again, the Viper, Jabril Peppers, Khalil Hudson. That's what he was. One of the hardest hitters you will ever see in a winged helmet. Certainly can't argue that he was a great player. I just, as I've been doing this for so many years, you hear the funny stories and it kind of changes your opinion of maybe how great a player was.
Final question, Michael Spath, as we conclude this mini-series for the offseason. If you and I are fortunate enough to be alive 35 years from now, who on this year's team for 2018 do you think has the best chance of being on the next 35 best players of the last 35 years?
Wow, that is a great question. I mean, the obvious choice is Rashawn Gary, but I think he will probably finish his career after this season, and I know that he'll have, a 15-sack season. I'm going to throw one at you, a little bit of my dark horse, and part of it's because he's at a position that I don't think Michigan has been overly strong at. They've had a couple of great players, but I honestly say watch out for Zach Gentry at tight end.
Wow.
I think his combination of size and athleticism, if Shea Patterson is the real deal and Michigan uses Zach Gentry the way that he could be used, I think he could be a, Benny Joproof, 55 catches, 700 yards, 8 to 10 touches type of season, which may take him to the NFL, but if he comes back for another year, he could put up just monster numbers and really make us think of like, wow, this guy is better than Jake Butt, better than Jeremy Tooman. If you're better than Jake Butt and Jeremy Tooman, guess what? You're on the 35th anniversary team.
See, I thought you'd pick Devin Bush because we haven't really had a linebacker. I mean, he has like Roquan Smith-like athleticism like we saw at Georgia last year. But when you look at the next 3 to 5 years at that position, as great as he is, even though we haven't recruited a lot of guys prior to Devin Bush that brings to the table what he does, they've actually got like 3 to 5 guys waiting in the wings they've recruited since him that seem to have similar athleticism and skill sets. So I don't, as great as he is, I don't know how all that unique he'll be even in the next 5 years, let alone, peering that far into the future.
No, you could be right. You could be right. And look at the defensive end. I mean, they're bringing in, Stephen Hinton, and they've got, or Chris Hinton, I should say, and then, they're recruiting Zach Harrison. I mean, they're doing really well with defensive line recruiting and with the way that Greg Madison coaches them up. So that's a position that's going to be of strength. They're doing really well at the cornerback position. I mean, you could lose Lavert Hill and David Long this year. Then you slide in Ambry Thomas, Benjamin St. Juste, Miles Sims. I mean, it comes down to really distinguishing yourself. And I agree with you that at least on the defensive side of the ball, maybe that's why I look on the offensive side of the ball. They've got some good tight ends, but I don't think they have anybody quite with his size and his athleticism in the hopper for the next couple of years. So we'll see. But I tell you what, at the end of this season, let's revisit this. I think it could be a great question to discuss.
Michael Spath, WTK Ann Arbor, thanks for joining us here on this Michigan Podcast Extra, Michael.
All right, thanks, guys.
Well, that'll do it. And hey, we love it when you guys let us know what you think about what we think. Subscribe to the audio podcast on iTunes. Leave us a positive review there. Do the same here on YouTube as well. Leave comments in the comments section as we get closer to the season. And once the season is here, I try to respond to as much of that as I possibly can. But please like us, subscribe, share this link with other Michigan fans that you know around the country. That helps us to get the word out. And for those of you that have been supporting us on Patreon throughout the course of this year, that helped to underwrite the cost of putting this production together all throughout the year, we greatly appreciate you, as well as our friends at Detroit Sports Podcast, which promote us each and every week too. Go Blue. We will see you again in July with our 2018 college football preview.